Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for having me here. Presenting a paper titled Making of Skilled Overseas Korean, which I wrote with my co-author, Lee Chun. Here in this presentation, I see visa policies as border practices. And this aspect wasn't so clear in the paper, actually, but it's an aspect that I'm working on and would certainly love your feedback. One particularities of such border practices is distinguishing long-term, not only who enters the border, but distinguishing long-term migrants who can possibly become citizens from short-term temporary migrants subject to circular, less skilled temporary labor migration scheme we're too familiar with. Approaching visa as border practices allows us to do four things. First, it allows us to explore the way in which the boundaries are drawn not only between citizens and non-citizens, but also between long-term permanent or quasi-permanent migrants and short-term temporary migrants, and different barometers used to distinguish these groups, such as skilledness, countries of origin, education, and other socioeconomic status. Secondly, I explore this concept of legality, not just from the migrant side, say whether or not the migrant is undocumented or documented, but from the assessment of a state laws and policies and whether their enforcement is legal or illegal, to allow for more holistic investigation of law's influence on society. Third, we can pay attention to the role of market in drawing the border, and here we understand market as not as a uniform, coherent body, but take multidimensional approach to see its complex and organic relationships with different functions and intentions that understand migrants as workers as well as consumers. Lastly, we pay attention to micropolitics between the state, the market, and the migrants themselves and explore how it results in particular border practices. And here's my question. South Korea's largest migrant group is co-ethnic workers from China, and they had rapid growth in the last 10 years. And the fastest growing visa status was the overseas Korean status, where they went from 0 in 2007, because they're not allowed to have that status, which I'll get to in a minute, to some 2,000 in 2008, and to 200,000 in 2014. This is significant because overseas Korean status is a quasi-permanent and skilled, at least on paper, visa, whereas the other status, working visit, which is another majority of a big group of status, is a temporary and circular, less skilled labor migration scheme. So in the paper, we argue that South Korean government utilizes skilled, unskilled divide as a way of staggering the migration process, and Korean Chinese migrants are required to pass multiple gates of temporariness in view of gaining full membership. Although the state rhetorically uses visa policies as quality control mechanism to selectively accept desirable population, it can only do so by relying on the market to assess the value of labor migrants, and this has caused consequences against express policy intentions. So to start with, I'm going to explain who Korean Chinese or Joseonjok migrants are. As of March last year, there are 1.8 million foreign residents, and 1/3 of them were ethnically Korean migrants from China who live in northeastern China near China-North Korea border. They had lost connection to South Korea due to Cold War politics of the Korean War that ended in 1953 with a ceasefire agreement. And it was after 1992 when South Korea, China diplomatic relationships were normalized that the South Korean government started to provide legal channel for ethnic Koreans to so-called return to South Korea as co-ethnic migrant workers. Overseas Koreans Act, sorry, it's not in there, was introduced in 1999 to provide a legal basis for Korean residing overseas. However, overseas Koreans from China and former Soviet countries were barred from obtaining the status until 2008, while the status was given to those in the West and Japan. Korean Chinese migrants especially came to rally in very large numbers in late 90s in protests. I've given it a title here, Class Disadvantage and Ethnic Privilege. And the former refers to historicity of overseas Korean visa to exclude some overseas Korean because it's a quasi-permanent form of visa, and the government was afraid that once you open a door, all Korean Chinese would flood into South Korea. But in 2001, the Constitutional Court struck down the law because it's discriminatory and gave the legislature 2 years' time to revise the law, which is especially generous time period. But the government actually revised the law past this deadline given by the Constitutional Court, and the revised law came to place in March 2004. However, it was not until October 2007 the law became an implementable form. This is because of South Korea's legislative and executive structure, where the law legislated by the National Assembly depends on its enforcement decree, which is written by the Executive Cabinet Council under the President. So in this case, the judicial oversight was limited, and the executive wing really pushed their limit. In 2003, the government installed no elementary labor rule on overseas Korean visa holders, a rule to ban overseas Koreans from China and former Soviet countries from working in less skilled labor sectors if they are successful ever in obtaining overseas Korean status. But there are already a substantial number of Korean Chinese working in less skilled sectors in the 90s, many of them undocumented. In mid-2000s, the Korean government started introducing a series of temporary labor migration visa for Korean Chinese. The most comprehensive one is called a working visit status. From the policy perspective, working visit status is a hybrid of two visas, one being the employment-based visa, and the other being the kinship ethnicity-based visa system. The name of a visa, working visit, inherits this hybridness. It inherits the legacy of visitation visa, which was used in the 90s by the Korean Chinese as means to enter the country and which they overstayed their visa to work, and therefore reiterates kinship ties and desire to visit so-called homeland. At the same time, the labor aspect of a visa is recognized because the scheme is categorized as foreign workforce migration and is subject to scrutiny of Ministry of Employment and Labor. In a way, working visit status further ethnicizes Korean immigration policies by overtly preferring ethnic Koreans over other non-ethnically Korean migrant workers. So scrutiny, for instance, explain South Korea's visa policies with a hierarchical structure because of the government's over-preference for co-ethnic workers. I won't go into the details of their privileges, but I have it on the table here. In 2010, it finally became possible for working visit holder to transition their visa to overseas Korean status. So the holy grail of overseas Korean status finally opened after 10 years. The focus of our paper is the ways in which this transition occurs, because not all Korean Chinese is eligible for overseas Korean status. There is a selection criteria, and we argue in the paper that the selection is in fact quite arbitrary. The border between overseas Korean and working visit status would believe is significant because, first of all, working visit visa is a temporary visa. You're barred from the prospects of obtaining citizenship, while overseas Korean is a semi-permanent, and you have access to citizenship and permanent residence pathways. Interestingly, migrants on working visa status are limited in their work, so they can do nothing but unskilled work, so-called unskilled work, while those on overseas Korean visa can do everything but unskilled work, at least on the paper. The transition between the two statuses has come despite the South Korean government's rhetoric of only selectively accepting Korean Chinese migrants as a result of a complicated web of micropolitics between Korean Chinese as a group, interministerial politics within the government, and the market of migration industry. So I said migration industry. Let me give you an example of how they play a role here. So the 2012 revisions allow for any overseas Korean from China or former Soviet country with national technical qualification to transition to OK status. So you can see in this flag here, this it's an F4 is overseas Korean. That's the name of the visa. So it's very much advertised. And what they do in these buildings is to educate the workers to get qualification, national technical qualification. As a national system, licenses those working in specific trades, craftsmanship, or other skill sectors. But in reality, in this scene, it's understood, qualification is understood to be a ticket to permanent residence. Certain qualification examinations that are deemed easier became very popular, causing the private education industry that offer training costs an exponential growth, marketing the qualification as a tool for prolonging their stay. From the government's perspective, selectivity of a qualification nonetheless attests the level and attainment, that is the skillness of a migrant applicant, because not all working visa holders can become overseas Koreans, and not all temporary migrants have access to semi-permanent residency and citizenship. I asked Ministry of Justice immigration officials how the qualification, national trade qualification, serves as a barometer for judging if one is skilled or unskilled when there is no requirement on previous work experience. So you don't have to have worked in the sector, or you also don't have to work in the sector where you're licensed after acquiring license. And he said that the certification is a barometer of necessary quality because the qualification examinations are too difficult for South Koreans to pass even, and not all South Korean nationals can pass. And having the certification attests minimum quality that migrants should possess for long-term residency and access to citizenship, however arbitrary. So invoking this concept of quality to describe new incoming foreign population is comparable to what sinologists have termed the politics of suzhi. And Agnos, for instance, uses a concept of suzhi in Chinese, which roughly translates to quality in English, to describe state prerogative to not only control population, but also to upgrade and maintain population quality to the standards adequate for modern nation state. In this case, amidst China's social transformation in the 20th century. Anagnos links quality to value, especially of surplus value and capital accumulation. Linking quality to value accumulation is especially pertinent for our study here in transnational context. Migration programs allow the state to handpick what type of population it desires through its policies, and the visa system becomes a quality control mechanism in which migrants are tested by private markets at their own expense to prove their value to the state on multiple facets. However, their qualities are also recognized by their performance in the market, either by providing labor in an industry which experiences shortage because local Koreans avoid working in those sectors, or by the ability to pass examination, which in real terms means the ability to pay for training in private education institution. The private education industry's gain from the test takers are significant, and I won't go into the exact numbers here because of time. But the quality that they receive, the quality of these education is questionable. And one example is the metal windows, this specific qualification called metal windows and drawers craftsman qualification. And this specific trade is largely unpopular among South Korean because it's outdated technology. But once this law came out in 2011, you can see the numbers growing from 400 to 8,000 and to 14,000 and dropping again to 500 when the ministry announced that they're no longer going to consider this examination. For visa purposes. So I'm going to conclude. Migration program allows the state to select the type of population it desires through its immigration policies, and the state in its rhetoric uses the visa system as a quality control mechanism for incoming population as means of controlling its borders. The process, however, is complicated in reality because the state outsources the market to test the value of labor migrants, and the migrants form an equivocal relationship with the market. The state may express its desire for professional elite or skilled migrants, yet the labor market may experience dire shortage in low-skilled sectors. Migrants also become consumers in the market, especially in the migration business, where visa paths, information, and opportunities are commodified and traded. And they're wanted in this market as consumers. It is in this ambiguous space that, on the one hand, creates confusion in policymaking at the top level and policy acceptance on the ground, but on the other, opportunities for migrants to claim membership to the nation state. Thank you.